Welcome. We call this edition Africa Update, wherein we'll attempt to take a look at some of the goings-on in that vast continent. Africa remains what it always has been, a trove of mineral wealth that has provided the basis of much of the wealth, power, comforts, and other advancements of Western nations. The development of the United States itself could not have happened without Africa. Today, much attention is given to the continuing upheavals in Africa without a clear analysis of the causes. Within the limits of this 1 hour, perhaps we can shed some light on what's going on in Africa and why.
Thank you, Gil.
How do we begin to take on such a broad subject and a broad topic? Africa, maybe we can start by really talking about the caliber of reportage about some of these upheavals that we've been seeing. Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and on and on and on. What are your impressions, and what kind of a report card would you give the media on what's going on in Africa?
I would probably give the media a D in its reportage on Africa. Failure to distinguish between certain situations. For example, when the genocide erupted in Rwanda, the media really didn't draw a clear distinction between that situation and what had occurred previously in Somalia, and it sort of accepted the U.S. hesitancy to do anything about the genocide because of its unhappy experiences in Somalia.
Mm-hmm. How would you say?
I would also say that you have to take a look at the types of correspondence that the international media has been sending to Africa in the last 10 to 15 years or so. People who really had no experience or no solid understanding about the history of Africa, be it political, economic, culturally, or otherwise. We lost very recently Howard French with the New York Times, who was based in Abidjan, who was the West Africa bureau chief, but who really covered a lot of the continent beyond his brief. And Howard was one of the last and few people who at least had experience working in Africa, going back to a significant portion of time. We've had people posted to be heads of bureaus in Africa who had come right off of the style section in major American newspapers. So right there, I think we lost a lot. One, because quite clearly Africa was not a priority. Two, it really it set a tone for the type of reportage that we got out of the continent. At times when we really needed some good analytical reporting, we ended up with a lot of people from the West basically making their reputations and instantly turning into foreign war correspondents.
Well, how does a correspondent from the United States make their way in Africa? Let's say they have not gotten it in their educational process. How would they begin to do a creditable job about what's going on in a particular African country to which they've been assigned?
Well, I think people have to go back and do research, as far as examining the political experiences in the continent. Pre-colonialism would be a place to start.
And what you're saying is that hasn't happened.
I don't think that very many people on the continent go to Africa with that kind of an intellectual body of knowledge to be able to even assess what they're seeing before their very own eyes. And I think also there's a certain type of elitism that occurs within foreign correspondents in the region, and people who don't fall into that group are very easily distinguished. The correspondents who go out and make it a point to really talk to people who are not the obvious first stop when you get to a Nigeria or the first stop when you get to a Kenya, and get out of the Foreign Correspondents Association's clubs and not spend their evenings sitting around talking to each other, but rather getting out there and really and creating not only a pool of sources who very much know what's going on and can also teach them a little something as they're doing their job, but who can also serve as an entree to them to the real story.
Let me ask you, Ms. Awona, how do you see it?
Personally, I was in Angola, and I actually lived this particular situation. I was working as a journalist, and in all fairness to some of the foreign correspondents, it was very difficult. It is a very difficult situation to be in a war zone and have access to areas where you can get true information. One of my suggestions would be to rely partly when there's a big block in going into those zones to get the information on the ground, to rely on local people who are well experienced and whose story it is to send the news out. And I actually saw some of this in the case of Angola. Now, whether this particular information is going to be diffused in the editing rooms of the West is another story altogether.
Is it your experience that the United States Information Service has supplied a lot of the information that correspondents utilize?
I believe so. Also, there is a lack of readily available information sources on the ground, for instance, with the research that Karina was talking about. And some of the more available information definitely does come from the U.S. Information Office.
What is your impression of the caliber of reportage, Mr. Brown?
I think that for the most part, they just deal with the effect. That's where they come there with a bias toward what Africa is and what Africa and who Africans are. As a
You
result,
mean when it hits the fan as opposed
right,
to
but
what
they never go
caused
to the
it?
causal factors. I mean, in every one of these situations, you can find a contradiction that the West had with that particular country for one or another reason, and why they had it when they went in there with a perception that would benefit them in the long run. In the question of like Somalia, you have a country that is really homogeneous. You know, it's one people, one language, one religion, you know. So all of those things that you talk about, tribal, ethnic rivalries, didn't exist there, but yet they found a way to deal with it, planned context, and had those people fighting against each other. And they came into the wake of a war that the United States was very much involved with, because they were playing in the Sino-Soviet split, trying to deal with, you know, Ethiopia and Somalia. They're playing them against each other, and then after you got rid of the dictator there, you know, the whole thing collapsed, and people then picked up to try to scramble for who was going to take power. For instance, I had an interview with Adid when I went to Uganda in '94, and although, I mean, you read all these things about the warlord and all these types of character, you know, projections, when he came to the Six Pan-African Congress, which is where he spoke at, he was treated very differently by the hosts of the conference, as well as all the people who came there from all over the world, Africans from all over the world. And as a matter of fact, the program he laid out, his vision, made me feel that he was much more a person who had a long-range view of Africa, and this could be called for the Pan-African Parliament, than as just a simple person that's running around there, you know, dealing with shooting one group over the other.
All right, I have to interrupt. We need to take a break. The program's calendar moves on. We'll be back right after this. The very painful phenomena that we've been seeing in many of these countries. Now we have the experts here. Most of these problems the result of something that has been going on from within the people of Africa or from without?
I think it's a combination of both.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, certainly Africa and Africa's leaders cannot escape completely without criticism of some of the things that have occurred. But I think by far the overwhelming majority of the problems are problems that have their genesis in the era of colonialism and what was done in the post-colonial era. You know, it's ironic, Gil, that many people think that Africa's biggest curse is its poverty, but in reality its biggest curse may be its wealth. And that wealth is never really distributed properly, and it's never really been at the disposal of Africa and its people. That wealth has usually wound up lining the pockets. And your introduction was very much on point when you spoke of how much the United States has benefited from Africa. And journalists never discuss that at all. Most of the American public thinks of Africa as a poor continent that is a basket case, when in reality it is a basket for the rest of the world.
I was going to say that, like in the case of Rwanda, you would think that these different ethnic groups are fighting, but in reality, in the history of Rwanda, the so-called Tutsi, the Batutsi and the Bahutu and the Batwa, all are from the Banyarwanda people. They all speak Kinyarwanda their language, so they speak a single language. And language is usually what they use to differentiate different groups in Africa. Yet, historically, because of the Watusi having a different role in society, being cattle herders, and you had the the Bahutu, who were farmers, they had a kind of a class relation that was really something that we would frown upon, but it worked in their particular instance. However, the colonialists exploited this. One of the things they did, when they came in, they noticed that some of the Watutsi had keener features, were very taller than the other people, and had certain what typical African features. And they constructed what they call the Hamitic hypothesis, meaning that these people who had keener features came from Egypt, came from Ethiopia, and therefore they were a ruling class. And so they used the Batutsi like that over the other people. And then they complicated the social relation they already had, so that then they played one group off against the other. And at first they ran a lot of Batutsi out, and who went to English-speaking countries. Because the French were involved in this too, they were very fearful of anybody who spoke French, because they saw their language as a way of establishing hegemony over a lot of the area in Africa. So that when these people ended up in this particular fight, and the French, friends of the United States, and also rivals, they backed up the Habyarimana government. And these people had already made plans to exterminate them. So it was a plan that was laid out, and the French backed the Hutu killers. So did the British, and all these people were involved. The Clinton administration ruled, so all the delegations, that you're not to use the word genocide in regards to Rwanda. That was official, that you could not use that word, because they knew that if you use the word genocide, then because the United States is a signatory to the 1948 Convention Against Genocide, that would obligate them to intervene, and they didn't want to do that. So when Clinton went there and made believe he didn't know what was happening, was in the office, it was really a lie, because they did know, and they allowed it to go down.
All right, we need to move on. How do you see it? My original question was, are the ills of Africa generated from within or from without?
Oh, it's certainly a combination of the two, but I think a great irony recently has been the United States wanting to basically take credit for this very new movement to try to restrict the diamond trade, for example. It was just shocking to open the newspaper a few weeks ago. We know, and we have known, and we have called upon the international community and gone head-to-head with the State Department and various other government representatives in Europe as well about the fact that they have allowed these armed insurgencies and these civil wars against the people of Angola and against the people of Liberia and in Sierra Leone, for example, and the Congo, to go on unabated, and they were being fueled by the control that the Savimbis and the RUFs and the Kabilas or the Mobutus had over the mineral resources in those countries. It's never been an issue because, unlike what I think the rest of the world thinks, business is going on in those places, even in these areas that Chika alluded to earlier as being very difficult to get to report on. They're very easy to get to if you're in the mineral business or the diamond or oil business. There's no problem there. There are helicopters that go back and forth every day. People are walking around with their sat phones. In the Congo, they're called attachés because they've got everything in that briefcase. They're wearing their suits in the middle of the tropics, and they're making money. What has actually set this recent sea change of attitude towards the fact that we have suffered so as the West has continued to make profits off of these illicit businesses is the fact that all of a sudden the glut of diamonds now that are on the market is threatening to send the price down. For the first time, De Beers is saying that they are interested in setting up some type of a cartel and ensuring that there are documents of origin as far as where these diamonds and such are coming from. That is still a profit-driven exercise, and I think for people not to understand that when the colonial masters left, that the multinational masters just stepped in and have continued is one place where we need to really become a lot more aware of the sophistication of business that's being done in Africa and how it helps to perpetuate these types of civil unrest because it allows people to go on unfettered.
To your knowledge, is there any African country whose economy is in the control, in the hands of the indigenous people?
Silence around the table.
Libya.
Yeah.
Libya?
Libya.
I don't know if there's a country in the world whose economy is in the hands of the indigenous people anymore. The increasing globalization of the world's economy, and let's look at the African trade bill, which is, I believe, an effort to bring Africa closely in line with America's priorities in the globalization of the world economy. And you'll see that the Americanization of the world's economy is increasing rapidly.
Well, it's no coincidence also that this unrest is taking place.
Coincidence is we got a break. Forgive me.
Yeah.
More after this.
No, actually, I was saying it's really no coincidence that all of these these countries with major turmoil and unrest, be it civil, political, or otherwise, are the countries that have the greatest mineral resources in the world, let alone in the continent of Africa. And I think we have to, people have to be very, very honest and very cognizant of the fact that Africa is where it is today because there's big business going on. And for the most part, leaders who are looking to the well-being of their fellow citizens and their futures are not the types of people who would allow the type of business to go on that is going on at this point in time in a lot of these countries like Congo and others. So we have to understand that and stop looking at Africa as this amorphous crisis of starving children and flies around people's eyes, and really look at where the sources of the wealth are coming from and who is involved in that.
Mm-hmm. And maybe this issue of globalization of the world's economy and bringing Africa in there, maybe in some instances that might be beneficial. But I think that there's been a lack of honesty and candor about the economic interests and about this effort to integrate Africa into that globalized world economy.
The biggest
You were
problem.
going to say?
Well, I didn't get a chance to respond to your previous question, which was regarding internal and external reasons why Africa is where it is today. I think that it's a combination of both, but I also think, as an African, that the Africans have to take responsibility. I mean, colonialism has been over. We've blamed it long enough, and now what can the Africans themselves do? Going back to your next question, which was, I believe, regarding the
Naming an African country that is in control.
I agree with Robert that there is none, literally in the world. But I think also that the drive towards pushing free market policies and free trade policies, if not checked, can really harm Africa even more. I'm looking particularly at the recently proposed Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which has a lot of good things about it. But if left the way it is without making provisions so that some of the benefits from this free trade can also go to the poorest of the poor, then it would just be another opportunity for the elite to make more money.
Well, in your analysis, what does free trade, the free trade agreement, really boil down to?
It boils down to opening up doors and for private business.
And diluting tariffs and taxes and things of that nature.
Exactly.
So that foreign businesses can set up factories and so-called sweatshops.
Without boundaries, without protectionism, and basically, if state intervention does not come in to sort of provide the social safety net that's necessary to allow the poor people who are going to be losing maybe some of the livelihoods that they've had because as a result of privatization of natural resources and forest areas, for example. I know of examples in places like Mozambique, for example, where people have been displaced literally without any buffer to alleviate their situation as a result of privatization.
You know, Gil, when the United States was developing its own economy, protectionism played a major role in the industrial growth, the agricultural and industrial growth of the United States. And you know, it's ironic as we close this century and move into the next century, if we go back and look at what W.E.B. Du Bois wrote earlier about the problem of color being the problem of this century. We go into the next millennium and color is still a major problem. He also wrote about the African roots of war between the European powers, and that's still a major problem, no longer between the European powers, but instead on behalf of the European powers.
The proxy issue.
Yeah.
The worst thing about H.R. 1432, the Rangel-Crane bill, is that it, for the first time, it puts Africans in a position of actually selling out, literally selling out their country. When
In
you look
what ways?
well, first of all, if you look at the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, the Africans had no delegate there. The United States did, but the Africans didn't. So therefore, what they did among themselves was to actually take the Africans' goods. So you could argue later on that we got ripped off. Then when they came with the gun, you know, and they were able to force people to give up their resources. But now they have African leadership signing on the dotted line, selling out their natural resources, selling out their means of production, so that you can't come back later on and say somebody did something to you because you're in a business deal and you actually literally signed on the dotted line. So therefore, that's why I always argue that the real AIDS question in Africa is an acquired imperialist dependency syndrome. You see, I mean, that's exactly, that's the real AIDS problem, you know, not any, this kind of thing about, you know, so much HIV, because all that deals with poverty. And how can you have the richest continent in the world, which Africa is, having the poorest people in the world? There's a fundamental contradiction there that says that it is because we don't have control of our resources is why we find ourselves in that position. So therefore, a bill that actually takes you further into that is no good at all. That's why when Jesse Jackson Jr. put forth the Hope Bill, which dealt with that, the African leadership had an out. They could have went and they could have said, wait a minute, we want you to help us, but this bill is better than the other one. But it never saw the light of day.
But as Sheikha says, given all of that, the real tragedy is to look at the quality of some of the leadership that Africa has been saddled with. You would think that in the wake of all that was done to Africa, that there would be some really dedicated. Of course, we know why some of the most dedicated leadership no longer exists. Some of it was systematically eliminated by intelligence organizations in the United States and Western Europe. But still, there is hope. There is some hope that the new generation will bring forth leadership that is accountable to the people in Africa and is not so immersed in corruption.
You've spent some time looking at and being in Sierra Leone. What can you give us in the way of a digest of what ails that African nation?
Well, what ails that African nation is its resources, again, I mean, going back to what we've discussed earlier, but also it's a very interesting situation. We have a government, elected government, and President Ahmed Tejan Kaba that really came into a situation that was very tenuous. You're facing a very extreme and severe civil war, basically. Did not prioritize certain elements of what was going on, and really focused on business as usual in ways that allowed the RUF to continue to gain ground. And when we ended up in a situation in Lomé, the Revolutionary United Front, when we ended up at the so-called peace table in Lomé a few months ago, we were in a situation where the government of Tejan Kaba had been forced out of office a couple of years earlier, had recently been almost forced out of office again in January of this year, with fighting in the streets of Freetown, where almost 4,000 people were killed in a couple of weeks, while simultaneously in Kosovo we had a fraction of that number of people killed. And
right. It's my unpleasant task, really, to try to adhere to our confines. We need to take a break. You understand, I know.
I have to discuss.
Are you friends with your spouse? A new breakthrough study says that is the key.
What kind of evaluation do you have for the impact of the President Clinton visit to Africa? Let's start with you, Mr. Brass.
Well, I mean, Clinton took his show on the road, and it was very interesting the countries he went to. Most of them had all been very much caught up into the IMF and the SAP, the structural justice programs. So they were actually online with Clinton. The one country where it would have been interesting for him to do some investigation of was when they took a safari. That was Botswana. Because Botswana, there's a base that's being built there, you know, with U.S. help, you know, for a country that has a very small population, a military base and a radio station in the middle of central southern Africa that we wanted to see more about. But that's the one country where they didn't do any details. Everything else, they went and showed you this and they talked about this and that. So we feel that the whole thing was really a promotion for the United States' new entrance into Africa as a savior. When the bill, again, the 1432, is, say, Randall Robinson, you know, really got put in the doghouse for going up against it. I think that when you start to look at the people who are concerned all the time about Africa's, you know, posterity and for its enrichment, that when we criticize it, suddenly, you know, we're the bad fellas, but the people who hated Africa, didn't want to deal with Africa, they praised it. The Republicans went crazy for that bill. I mean,
okay, let me move on. You've been chomping at the bit for a number of reasons. Tell us why.
Well, you had mentioned previously that you think that the Hope Bill is better, and I agree that the Hope Bill has a lot. It's very much a people bill. It's very much oriented towards the people in Africa, but we have to be realistic in this day and age of a Republican Congress that would, I seriously doubt, would go for that bill. But I think that a synergy between the AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and the Hope, the good things about both, could be put together in order to, I don't agree with just one of those two bills.
May I ask you a question about Angola? Would there be an ongoing quarrel between the government and Mr. Savimbi were it not for the sustenance that Mr. Savimbi is getting from without?
I think there will be, so long as Savimbi is able to fuel his war machine with external assistance.
He's getting help.
He's getting help.
Without help, he would not be a force.
I absolutely believe that's true. And it's going to, the situation in Angola needs political will on both sides. But as long as Savimbi is able to wage war, and effectively, it's given the government a very good run for its money in this last...
His support has come, originally the word was that he was getting a lot of support across Namibia from South Africa. Apparently that's been beaten back, but he still gets support. Is it from the White House? In your analysis?
I don't believe that it is as much from the White House today as it used to be. He definitely is getting assistance coming in, but it's not clear whether it's directly from the White House. I believe there's a lot of regional assistance from countries like Zambia and even from Zaire, from the Congo. You know, he has allies that are helping him get at least the weapons. And
the thing about Savimbi is Savimbi has always been propped up by somebody, even when he was supposed to be fighting against the against the Portuguese. There were letters that were discovered in 1974 after the fall of the Portuguese fascist government that showed that Savimbi had been in sync with the Portuguese fascists fighting against the MPLA. So Angola is a country that has been under a war situation since 1961 at least. Now, Savimbi gets a lot of money from illicit diamonds, over $4 billion worth of diamonds that helps him to find. But even before that, when he was getting help from South Africa, the racist regime of South Africa, he was also getting help from the United States government as well as the people who opposed, you know, the U.S. government because of party politics. So therefore, he's always been a beneficiary of the right wing in this country. You know, Jesse Helms is one African that Jesse Helms likes is Savimbi. So he's always been propped up.
maybe the only one.
That's right. So the thing I'm saying is that Savimbi serves he serves the interests of the United States in that the kind of government that they wanted before was one that was not a Marxist-Leninist, which was what the People's Republic of Angola was. So therefore, they still carry on the fact that he is pro-capitalist, pro-private enterprise, and if he could actually win, if they could actually win this war, they would be all swarming over Savimbi and saying, well, we do it all the time. All you have to do is follow the press. Just like in the question of Congo. The Congo...
Excuse me, how is this support of Savimbi manifest? Does it come from business interests that funnel their monies?
It comes from business interests, as we said before. It comes from also the illicit diamond trade, that he's been able to hold a territory.
Do U.S. government agencies play a role in the trafficking of this money?
I wouldn't say some of the U.S. government interests play a role in so much of diamond trade. This is private people.
No, I mean the oil.
As said before about that's only difference I have is that De Beers is the cartel. It's not that he's trying to worry about a cartel. Though this bill was. De Beers has always been a cartel because they have, from the time that Oppenheimer has actually laid out a way to make money off of diamonds by restricting the amount of diamonds they put on the market based on the kind of engagements, actual, nuptials, so that how many people are going to get married. They figured out a scheme to base the holding of a certain amount of diamonds off the market. That's why everybody wanted to have, the Bears always wanted to have the diamonds come through then. And as Acuna said before, the fact is that once these diamonds get out here, they're set loose, then they have to go back to try to get the market back again because they cannot actually adjust the price. Because the manipulation of marketing boards has always been a way they've undermined governments. They did it to Nkrumah with a cocoa marketing board by dropping the price of cocoa.
Well, you have to.
You know what I'm going to say? Break. I'm trying to stay out of your way. There's so many amplifications that need to be made. Let's start with you.
Well, I think first we have to understand that the West has always supported both sides in any of our conflicts and struggles, and as a way of being prudent and ensuring that they're in the right place at the right time when changes occur. However, I think Savimbi and Kabila and the like are the types of Africans that the West can do business with. I mean, and in a way, they're interchangeable. I mean, if tomorrow there was someone else who were able to sell diamonds to Denmark or Amsterdam or wherever, they would buy it from them, and Savimbi would be gone. What Alambe had mentioned earlier, though, about the history of the Savimbi experience here in the United States, and we certainly cannot underestimate the amount of support that he has received for decades from Washington. And also that there was an entire lobbying industry around Savimbi for so many years. And interestingly, one that was reenacted and brought back to life, resuscitated basically, during the Abacha years. We found the old lobbyists for Savimbi all of a sudden back in business from around 1995, 1996 in Washington to help promote General Abacha, who the West clearly stated was the only person who could hold Nigeria together. So in that regard, I think we also should not forget the complicity of our own government and our own government officials. Everyone is in there to make the money while they can.
All right, let me raise a question. We've seen a number of businesses that are going over to Africa, wooing various nations in Africa. And at the forefront are many well-known African Americans. This is not pleasant talk, but you know the name of the program. Let's talk about that. How do you evaluate that?
I'll tell you that during the very, very difficult years from '95 until last year when General Abacha died, some of our worst enemies came from within. We had people who went on junkets to Nigeria, all expenses paid, people that we never expected. I mean, there's certain people in the Senate who served to really really set us back as far as trying to educate and inform the international community about what was really going on in Nigeria, and also
certain people in the U.S. Senate?
yes.
Well, there haven't been too many, so that narrows it down a bit.
She's gone.
She's gone now?
Yeah.
Gee, I don't know who you're talking about.
So, I mean, but this was, there was a very, very long list of groups and individuals who for, I guess, what I would consider a very, very low price, were bought to a certain extent, in that they were used to promote that government at a time when it was quite clear, and also post the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the 8 other Ogoni activists, that we knew and that they were aware that what they were doing was quite had incredible repercussions in that country, by providing the U.S. government and the West with an out, basically. As long as the U.S. government and other Western governments could say, well, people are going back and forth and they're coming back, respected people are saying that, for example, well, there's freedom of the press in Nigeria. We see publications on the streets that are criticizing Abacha. Well, consider that there is no alternative to General Abacha. You know, people discuss freely, and there are people within the government who promote certain democratic goals. So we have Nigeria 2000 and Nigeria 2010 and all these resolutions, and it really set us back. It really set us back.
You're fit to bust.
Yeah.
Well, I want to go back just a minute to Savimbi, if we can.
All right,
because
very briefly.
I think that one of the things we've also got to understand, that in a situation like that, there are some renegades who will do business with someone like him, despite the policies of their governments from surrounding countries in the region. Even within Angola itself, some of the people that Savimbi is engaged in business with are some of the people that he's supposed to be fighting, unfortunately. He now has the capability, and the resources to sometimes sustain himself, because the earlier support from Washington may not exist in the form that it once did. He can develop alternative sources of support.
In all these countries, they have a fifth column. The fifth column elements that operate on their own behalf. You know, and in the case of Angola, it's the same thing.
That's right.
And you have to always remember. In fact, let's say Abacha. Abacha came here when Babangida was the president. He was feted by George Bush. You know, and if the Colonial powers squired him around, you know, and they gave him the highest military, or the highest decoration for a military officer ever, who from a foreign country. So the fact is that he was not an unknown quantity when he took over, when he pulled his so-called coup.
The Nigerian situation is, you know, people now in Nigeria, I think, have hope that there is a civilian government. The current president, Obasanjo, is himself a retired general, but nonetheless he's one who did turn power over to a civilian government in 1979. Now, I think the last time that civilians inherited power in Nigeria, there was a great deal of optimism. Now I would say there's more hope than optimism.
With a very big dose of cynicism,
yeah,
too.
A very big dose of cynicism.
General Obasanjo gave us General Abacha.
That's
so
right.
let's
And
thank him for that as well.
a big issue is will Nigerians have time to build the institutions that can try to strengthen democracy and accountability in their country? Will there be time to do that? I think that all of us should try to help Nigerians and grassroots organizations and create a structure, create even legal institutions, legal system where there can be checks and balances, where the military is not the strongest institution in the country and able to impose its will.
Ah, there's the rub.
Yes. Yes.
Speaking of rubs, another time for another break. We'll be back. So we've seen in discussing these many countries that this factionalism really is about differences between each other as opposed to fighting for the ultimate control of the country. In other words, as you were telling me, the problems in Angola is not really over who's going to control Angola, because that seems to be a given, that the oil companies and the diamond interests are going to prevail. It's just whether it's going to be the existing government or whether it's going to be Mr. Savimbi, and the same thing seems to be implicit there. How is the African, who really is of my concern, how is the African really going to get out from under all of this labyrinth of controls and limitations? You have the rivalry, you have the presence of business, you have the presence of foreign governments that are coming in, you have opportunism from within the African people and from African Americans, as you say. How is what is the option of hope for the African?
Yeah, the collapse of the Soviet Union and socialist bloc, which was an option for Africans before, at least as far as national liberation was concerned. You have a unipolar world, so the United States has its way. It can do almost what it wants economically. So the thing is that in governments, you would have to have governments that at least are going to try to do something for the people to try to get the best deal that they can, given the circumstances. I want to go to the Congo, because I think that we really haven't touched
briefly, because this is the last segment.
Yeah, the fact is that you had a legitimate government in the Congo in 1960, Patrice Lumumba, and I worked around the UN mission with the ambassador designate, Thomas Kanza, and I've been with that struggle since that time. And I would say that during that particular time, you have had 9 U.S. presidents and 11 administrations that have supported, the idea that Lumumbas should not get back in there. I disagree with anybody, that says that, because Savimbi and Kabila are the same, are flip sides, because I've met Kabila. I interviewed him 3 times, probably one of the few people. And from all I've discussed with him, and the tape is available, that you can see his thinking is not so much for the corporations. As a matter of fact, if that had been the case, there would have been no intervention from Rwanda and Uganda.
I have to intervene, though, right, Alambe, because we need to move on to the rest of the table. What is the option for the African, given what I stated at the outset?
Well, I think certainly there's a homegrown movement in Africa towards democracy. It's one that started a long time ago. It's one that technically, I guess you could say, flourished for a period of time in the beginning of this decade, and has
Where
really...
is it most obvious now?
We take a country like Mali, for example, which very few people talk about because there's very little struggle going on in Mali politically and such. This is a country that came out from under a military dictatorship. We have a government that's committed to the basic principles of democratic governance. We have an environment where there's freedom of expression, one thing that's very rare throughout Africa, and where people have moved forward. There's a national identity. There's a common goal to overcome poverty and the repercussions of being a part of the Sahel. Okay. And this is the type of a movement that was occurring throughout the region,
so
and it's one that has to be supported.
All right, let me move on. What are your thoughts about the options for a real African,
First of all, I think there has to be a recognition of the complexity of the issues. Secondly, I think we have to also recognize that there are many talented and creative Africans. There are so many Nigerians here in the United States now who can contribute so much to the real development of their country. What is needed, though, is to create an environment in which people can safely return and agitate, because I know of not a single government ever in the history of mankind that has been a champion of civil rights unless the people in that country agitate, and confront government constantly.
I have to second what Robert just said, and to add simply that the Africans, depending on who you're talking about, if you're talking about the ordinary African, they have to get the opportunity to be educated about the political situation and to develop a sophistication in appreciating what it is that is expected of them as part of a civil society that can agitate once more for change. There is so much, and also the private sectors that are going to develop with a lot of foreign influence should be able to, with the money that they have and the influence, make a difference.
Guess what? We're out of time.
That's it.
That's it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
This discussion will go on. Thanks for being with us. Good afternoon. For a transcript, send $4 to Like It Is, 800 All News, 1535 Grand Street, Denver, Colorado, 80203. For a service, call 1-800-ALL-NEWS or visit their website at www.800allnews.com.